What is a Pathfinder? The United States Army Pathfinders infiltrate denied areas to set up parachute drop zones for follow-on forces. The Pathfinder Podcast is a platform to uncover the thoughts and methods military veterans have applied to become Pathfinders in their own right. Here at Arizona State University's The Blaze Radio, I uncover how these veterans chose their paths with all the trials and successes along the way. I'm your host, Salty the Sun Devil, and this is the Pathfinder Podcast. Welcome to the Pathfinder Podcast. This episode is episode number 1, and I'm Salty the Sun Devil, here at Arizona State University's The Blaze Radio. Today I'm joined by my good friend Tom Forbes, who I fondly call the Mouth of the Southwest. Tom is a sports journalism major at the Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication. Tom, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. I got a question for you.
Sure.
Why are you using the name Salty Sun Devil?
Well, there's a lot of good answers for that. I'll give you a couple. So first, Salty the Sun Devil. I'm a salt life guy. I love going to the beach. Second is I've seen some shows that have started at Arizona State here at the Blaze Radio, and then after the person who hosted it, who had it under their name, it just faded away. So my idea behind kind of using a pseudonym is to be able to hand this off to the next person who wants to carry on the show, kind of like the way Dear Abby passed her column down. So let's listen to Tom Forbes and some of his announcing magic from one of his hockey matches.
Please welcome to the ice, the hottest mascot in all of the land, Salty the Sun Devil.
That is amazing, Tom. It must take a lot of energy to belt out that in a game.
Yeah, it takes a little bit of preparation. You got to prepare your voice a little bit so that during the middle of the game or towards the end of the game, you're not losing your voice. You want to make sure that you're always on top of your game and that you sound just as good at the end of the game as you do at the beginning of the game. There's a lot that goes into it, but it's a lot of fun. That's
got to be really hard. I am not fond of the sound of my voice, and to be honest, I'm not super excited about having my voice recorded on a podcast, but hey, here we are. And the reason we're here is we have a mission that we're going to try and accomplish for students here at Arizona State University and for the veteran community in general who are attending Arizona State University. As I said earlier, this is going to be episode number 1, and what I want to do is just lay out the map of what the Pathfinder Podcast is.
So first of all, how'd you come up with the title of Pathfinder Podcast?
It's a good question. So in the United States Army, there is a group of soldiers called Pathfinders, and they're mainly famous from their World War II days where they parachuted behind enemy lines, behind the German enemy lines, to set up the drop zones for the large airborne divisions, the 82nd Airborne and the 101st Airborne, to parachute in and invade Europe. So the idea behind using the name Pathfinder is that I and the people who follow me are going to bring stories to the listening audience of those who've gone before us, those who've gone into this service, considered going into the service, gone into the service, and then what they did afterwards to continue their mission. And what I mean by that is when you're in the military, many people sign up for just various reasons. Sometimes they're looking for a skill. Sometimes they just want to, they're not sure what they're going to do. But not everyone, but majority of them find this bug of the mission. And what I mean by that is you have a camaraderie in the military and a focused goal between all the folks that you work with in the military. And it could be anything from being a logistics person, delivering, supplies to, the folks who are out on the front lines to the folks who are out on the front lines who are fighting the enemy. We'll get into that further in the Pathfinder Podcast when we talk to some of our guests.
So there's many different avenues that everybody takes during service and even after the service. So this podcast is primarily focused on veterans' paths of success after military service.
That's right. So I'm actually fairly new here at Arizona State University, but the other reason I use the name Salty is I'm an old salty guy. I'm probably one of the oldest students. I might be the oldest student here at the Cronkite School. So back to what you were mentioning about the military and going to school. So there's one great benefit that the U.S. government and the military provides to veterans once they get out of service, and that's the GI Bill. And there's actually many flavors of the GI Bill, and there's also some benefits that active duty military can use while they're still in the military, called tuition assistance, where the tuition's paid for. But what I'm utilizing is what's called the post 9/11 GI Bill to fund my schooling here. So it's a great program, and if you look historically at post World War II GI Bill recipients, it was one of the biggest engines to the economy of the United States. And I'm hoping by being a little bit, illustrative on how that works in this podcast and how some people have, made successes out of it, that we'll keep fueling that engine of this great country we call the United States.
So you want to focus on how people after military service can use the GI Bill to add to their success and maybe help their avenues to have a better starting point.
Yes, but it's not going to be exclusively to that. I'm also going to look at speaking with veterans who've decided to go into business for themselves, entrepreneurs, veterans who've started nonprofits to support other organizations or other groups of people who are in need. So there's a lot of stories in my short time here at Arizona State University, meeting the veterans here of what's happening out there, and there's some really amazing stories we're going to bring to the audience.
Speaking of stories, why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself?
I didn't have a burning desire to join the military when I was young. I remember when I was in grade school, I used to go in the library and read, books on military, on different types of military equipment and weapon systems. I was fascinated by that, but it wasn't something that was all driving for me. Another thing I did was I used to build models, World War II style models. That was fun, and I was kind of fascinated by that. But again, it wasn't driving me to military service. In fact, I was kind of afraid of military service when I was turning 17. There's the time where you're told, hey, it's time to sign up for selective service. And I'm old enough that I remember, Vietnam veterans who were drafted and kind of like what that's like to be like told, hey, your number came up and you're going to go get trained and you're going to go off to war. We're in a all volunteer military now, so it's completely different. But back then I was a little bit nervous about it, specifically because I'd recently had watched a documentary on the Falklands War, which was a war between Argentina and England, or actually the United Kingdom as a whole. And the documentary was pretty horrific. I saw some folks on both sides of that conflict who were just, either killed or they were maimed horrifically, and they were interviewed. I saw a sailor who talked about how his ship got hit by a missile and he was trying to evacuate the ship and he fell in molten metal and it burned his hands off. So as a 17-year-old, I was pretty freaked out about that whole scenario of what it would mean to go to war. Cut to, I go to university, and this is a time frame when the economy was doing really well, and most university students at the time were pursuing business majors or engineering majors. It was a very, very hot time for that kind of major. And I decided to go to a business school. And, I saw myself going into corporate America and, kind of like, doing great things, building businesses or being a part of building a business. And it was funny. I had a good friend who was in the Army ROTC program. And he and I used to go out and party together, just do the Friday night happy hours. And one night we went out and had a particularly, fun night. And I went to check on my friend the next day because I knew, he'd probably be hungover. So I went and visited him at his dorm room, and he was just passed out. And while I was just hanging out in his room, I started looking at some of his, stuff he had sitting around there. And he had this book called the Ranger Handbook. So the Ranger Handbook is the handbook that the United States Army Rangers use as kind of like their technical manual on how they operate. I sat there and I read that thing from cover to cover, and my friend woke up and he's like, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I just read your Ranger Handbook." And he said, "Oh, yeah, that's cool." I said, "Do you got to do this?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, time for me to go and sign up." So it was kind of a very impulsive thing. But I was just the challenges that are, presented. I was looking for a physical and mental challenge. I thought being a corporate person wasn't going to give me the physical aspect in life that I was looking for. And I wanted to be a leader, but I wanted to be a physical leader too. So I ended up, going into the ROTC program, and they offered me a scholarship, which was pretty wild. I didn't expect it, but it sure took a burden off me. When I was going to school, I worked at the school, in the cafeteria, at the front desk in my dormitory, And I would literally sign my checks and hand them right back to the school to pay for my tuition. So when I got in the Army ROTC, I was, the burden was taken off me, and then I had some other opportunities presented to me too. So when you're in the ROTC, you can join a reserve or National Guard unit. And I joined a National Guard Infantry Ranger Company. It was called a Ranger Company, and it was later called a Long Range Surveillance Detachment. So I joined that company, and that was just a blast. I was getting paid to jump out of airplanes while I was in college. And I couldn't believe, how fortuitous it was that I read this Ranger Handbook. I signed up for this ROTC program, and I literally got into the Army and started doing really cool stuff. And I was in the Army I commissioned as a second lieutenant, became an officer in the infantry, which the Army has different branches. You do different functions. Infantry is basically the people who carry rifles, and, they shoot things and blow things up. So I did that for several years, and then I got out. And then I don't want to get too deep into my story, but I ended up coming back in after 9/11. And interestingly about that is I was working with a company that had a relationship with the Arizona Cardinals. And I have an affinity with Pat Tillman because of this. Because we had this relationship with the Cardinals, and I kind of knew about him and what his philosophy was, because he was an ASU student, and he stayed in Arizona and joined the Cardinals. And he signed up and joined the Ranger Regiment in the United States Army. And I'm sitting there asking myself, what are you doing? And that was that. So I ended up going back in the service, and I served several years after that during the global war on terror, I guess. So that's kind of my story in a nutshell. And how I ended up at ASU is I had the GI Bill benefit, and I had not used it, and I got a letter telling me, hey, if you don't use your benefit, it's going to go away. So I started doing some research, and I figured out what I wanted to do here. And I wasn't very smart in media and social media. So that's what I'm in. I'm in a program that does digital marketing here at Arizona State University.
So what appealed to you more about Cronkite versus any other school?
That's a good story, because originally I looked at the business college. Originally I was a business major, right? And I considered getting a master's degree because I already had a bachelor's degree in business. That's a requirement if you're an officer in the military. And I thought, I want to broaden myself more. And actually, currently what I'm doing, I have a major in what's called digital audiences. So there's the digital marketing in the business college, but it's not exactly what I was looking for as far as a curriculum and getting into the whole social media, Google enterprise side of things. I think the digital audiences program at Cronkite gets more in depth with that. So that's kind of how I ended up here. But I'm also taking several minors to try and broaden my knowledge. I'm taking a minor in tourism because I'm considering starting a boutique tourism business. So I basically am kind of putting my toe in the water in a lot of things, with a main emphasis of understanding kind of like the digital communication world.
There's a lot going on in the digital communication world, but can you explain to us what the lack of digital currency is and what attributes to that?
Well, that's a tricky one because I'm still a student. But what I can tell you is from a digital literacy standpoint, there's kind of like a curtain. It's almost like the Wizard of Oz. What's going on behind the scenes with, you use social media, right?
Yep.
What's going on behind the scenes though, right? How are those applications being used for business purposes, because they are a business? And the interesting thing is that most people, they don't see it that way. They just see it as a service that they use. But the one thing I tell everybody is if you're using a service and you're not paying for it, you're the product. Meaning all the digital footprints that you leave when you're online are collected, packaged, and resold over and over again. And it's not that I want to try and understand that fully and put that to use in my life, but I want to learn how to harness that. Let's say I wanted to start a boutique tourism business. There's probably a specific market that I might go after. So let's say hypothetically, I used to go to Europe and go to soccer matches. And a company that I used to attend some of the matches was a company called Thomas Cook, which is no longer in business. It's bankrupt now. I'm not sure exactly why they went bankrupt, but they were a massive tour company. If you wanted to go to a Formula One race or you wanted to go to the Ashes cricket match in Australia, they could arrange it for you. I used them to go to the Barcelona versus Real Madrid match, which is known as the El Clasico. And, it's not easy to get tickets for those. So they arranged for tickets, lodging. If I wanted airfare, they could have arranged that for me, but I didn't need it. But it's kind of one of the things you would look at from a market standpoint. Well, who's going to go to that match? It's going to be somebody of this age, somebody that's obviously a fan of football or soccer, but there's going to be specific demographics that can be teased out of a social media presence from somebody, and those people can be communicated to. A good example of this would be, I worked at what's called the Cronkite Agency this past summer, which is kind of like a mock PR agency / digital marketing firm at ASU. The students work with clients on specific marketing and advertising campaigns. I did a campaign for a magazine here at Arizona State called Global Sport Matters, and they were doing pieces on the Women's World Cup in New Zealand. I think it's New Zealand, yeah. And that tournament, we wanted to generate more readership in the magazine, and we also wanted to raise awareness of the tournament. So I did a campaign on both Instagram and Facebook, doing ads to specific demographics in specific locales, and the response was huge, because the Global Sport Matters is a really vivid magazine, online magazine, and once you look into it, you get hooked. So that's kind of a good example of how I'm using my education and trying to kind of make things happen here.
It seems like within your degree field at Cronkite, you're also doing a little bit of statistics and marketing involved with it. You're doing everything together. Yeah. You
have to do a broad look at what your education should be to be able to fulfill kind of like the mission that you're trying to achieve with. If you're trying to be an entrepreneur, if you want to go to work for a company, if you want to go to work for a company, you're going to want to be able to present to that company what are the specific things you can provide them. You need to not just be savvy in social media marketing. You need to understand statistics. Computing is a big thing too. Understand how do you write programs for websites, because you're going to have clients. Let's say you worked for a PR firm, they may have a website that needs things fixed, and you either need to be able to do that yourself or be able to refer them to somebody who's a reputable company that would be able to provide that service for them.
So you're talking about this a little bit earlier in the show, that this podcast is going to be divided into 3 different segments: pre-military service, military service, and post-military service, which is continuing the mission. So what is your post-military service path?
So I mentioned earlier I went back on active duty after 9/11. I actually didn't get, I was in the reserves, and I didn't get back on active duty very quickly. I mean, there was a massive amount of people that were trying to get into the fight after the United States was attacked. So it took me a while to get on active duty. So I did that for about 6 years, mainly deployed the whole time, away from the United States. And it was exciting. I made great lifelong friends doing those missions, and I saw things that I'll never forget, and some things I probably want to forget. But I did that for like 6 years. I came back and I worked for a couple of big Fortune 500 companies up until 2021. One thing that kind of prompted me was the GI Bill. I just wanted to try a new chapter, and I'm actually looking more entrepreneurial. I want to start a small business and maybe get some of my family members involved in it.
So now your mission now is, part of your education is you're going above and beyond just the education part of it, but you're also taking advantage of the facilities that we have here, winning different paths that others have taken through the interviews that you're going to be doing on this podcast.
You got that exactly right. Life's an adventure, and you need to approach it that way. It's hard. We're all presented with challenges, especially the veteran community. one of the hardest things when you leave the military is that you give up that camaraderie, the folks that you live and work with. I mean, I had times where I had to live on a cot 2 inches away from the people on my right and left when I was in Kuwait, on my way into Iraq. They have what are called intermediate staging bases, and you go there and you do some things to prepare, you train up to get ready to go, and there's just a ton of people there, so there's no space. And you learn to adapt to those conditions, and because you're with all these people that close, you become very close friends, and you learn how to work together and support one another. And the biggest thing is that, helping each other in those circumstances creates a really strong bond. And I think you can do that in any situation, to be honest. You find that the people that, are going to have that strong drive like you do. I mean, that's how I met you, Tom. We were in a 100 level class with, they were all transfer students because we were transfer students, but they were mainly sophomores. A lot of them like 19 years old. And I looked around in the crowd. I'm like, all right, there's Tom, that guy. I think he, based on what he's doing in class, he's attentive, he's working hard. He's a guy I want to get to know. I do that in every single one of my classes. And I have students from almost every single class that want to have coffee with me regularly and just kind of talk about what their plans are. Because, I've been there and done that, right? And if you don't take advantage of somebody who's been there and done that, then you're being a fool. And that, to me, it's a blessing for me because I think, like I said, the GI Bill is a driver of the United States, as a country and for the economy, but also those of us who are here who are on the GI Bill and don't have the pressures of having to pay for our tuition, we can help our fellow students, be that much better in their classes too. I had one student last semester, and again, it's another low-level class in computing, like 100 level, and we did a group project, and I said to one of them, there was 4 of us in the group project, and I said to them, oh, I bet you guys are going to be glad it was a tough class. I didn't enjoy it. I said, you'll be glad this is over. And one of them, young man named Benjamin, he said, oh, I'm really kind of sad. And I was like, really? I'm like, this class is not fun. He said, it's not fun, but I enjoy working with you guys. And that's, I think, one of the biggest things you can take away from school, or in anything, really, quite honest. But from going in your classes, reach out to your fellow students, get to know them, see how you can support them, and you'll find it very rewarding.
And that's part of what we pay for here is that we come here to develop and foster these connections, and we work together as a team, and we go through these hardships through some of these classes where we're like, oh God, this sucks.
Yeah. And
then we just go through it, we continue to push through, and then afterwards we're looking back and we're like, oh yeah, remember how terrible that class was, but we did a great job. We had fun actually doing it. That's really what it's about.
Absolutely.
So what do we have coming up next on this podcast that we should get excited for?
Well, I've got a couple of guests already lined up. I don't want to give away the lead too quickly. I have one. It's going to be my next guest is going to be kind of a unique guest. She's actually on active duty right now, and she is a PhD graduate from Arizona State University, and she's doing research for the United States Navy in the aviation field and hydration while pilots are in the air. The Navy calls them aviators. And hydration and hypoxia. And hypoxia is the low level of oxygen at high altitude. You probably heard about the story about Payne Stewart, the golfer. His plane lost pressure. They became hypoxic, and then they ended up dying in the aircraft, and the aircraft crashed. So she does research in that. I'm very fascinated to hear her story. One of the things I do when I do a pre-interview with guests, I don't go too deep into their story because I like to be surprised and have an authentic reaction to what they're sharing with me, so the audience can kind of feel the emotion that's going on when we talk.
Well, it sounds like you got quite the path ahead of you.
We'll see. It's the beginning stages, and I'm hoping to get some really good guests lined up. The last thing I want to talk about is I'm going to provide some advice at the end of every podcast. I'm going to call it Dadvice. So Dadvice is basically an abbreviation for dad advice. And I kind of came up with this idea because I had a class. It was kind of funny. I was in a class with ROTC cadets. It was just an elective I took on national security. And a bunch of ROTC cadets who were soon to be lieutenants were in the class. And when they realized I was a retired officer, they kind of were like, hey, asking me questions. So I started on Tuesdays, I would provide them kind of like what I call a pro tip. Just a little thing that makes things easier when you're in the military service, like a little tip or trick on, could be like how to do something with your uniform to make it, function or fit better, or a piece of equipment, or like one of them I taught that they really dug was, there's 3 ways you can die in this world. 1 is lack of water, 2 is lack of food, and the 3rd one is from exposure. So exposure, it's either from heat or from cold. And what I carry around with me is a Bic lighter with duct tape wrapped around it. And the reason I do that is duct tape burns. So if you need to start a fire quickly, you need a petroleum product to start that fire. So you can tear that duct tape off the Bic lighter, make it into a little ball, get some tinder, start that duct tape on fire, and you've got a fire instantly. So that would be my pro tip that I used to do. And I used to do this other thing called Critical Thinking Thursdays, where I would ask them a question where they would have to think critically about a specific problem. And it would be a military-related problem based on my experience in the over 20 years of service that I did. And, they would kind of like rack their brains around it, and then I'd give them the solution if they didn't come up with it. And it was pretty enlightening for them. I was actually pretty pleased. A lot of them had some even better solutions I provided, especially the ones who are what we call prior service, somebody who served previously as an enlisted person, and then they decided they want to become an officer and they go to the ROTC program. So that's what I'm going to close out all my sessions with, is some dad advice. I guess today we'll use the dad advice as that whole Bic lighter tip. And those of you out there who are listening, get your Bic lighter, get your duct tape, and you'll always have a fire. And with that, we will close it out. Tom, I appreciate you being my guest host with me today, starting off episode 1, laying out the map for that path of the Pathfinder podcast. And we'll close it out.